1939, and the fires of war in China were still raging. Half a world away, Czechoslovakia, dismembered by the Munich Pact, fell to Hitler without a battle. Hitler demanded that Poland surrender the Baltic seaport of Danzig with its strategic corridor to the sea, a prize lost by Germany in 1920 at the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. Poland did not yield. In defiance of British and French warnings, the Nazis, after making a secret non-aggression pact with Russia, invaded Poland September 1st, 1939, with their smashing blitzkrieg tactics. The heroic Poles fought the invaders with a courage that was phenomenal, but futile against overwhelming odds. The fiery curtain to Act I of World War II was raised. Britain and France declared war. The die was cast. Now British Prime Minister Chamberlain knew there would be no peace in our time. The United States proclaimed its neutrality, just as it had at the beginning of World War I. 3,000 miles of Atlantic Ocean, it seemed, were still an ample safeguard for the immediate defense of our nation. In a cynical agreement, Germany and Russia had partitioned conquered Poland. Soon, Russia attacked Little Finland. The valiant Finns fought the Russians to a standoff. In China, the two Asian giants continued their struggle to the death. With the rest of the world exploding into violent war, the New York World's Fair opened to throngs of peaceful and pleasure-loving Americans. The wars in Europe and Asia were still far away. We read about them in the newspapers and watched. Again, as at the beginning of World War I, we had proclaimed our traditional neutrality. Millions of Americans were more interested in Joe DiMaggio and the New York Yankees taking 4 straight from Cincinnati in the World Series than they were in the deadly games being played in Europe and Asia, where aggressors were out to take all. In the grim international game of war, the aggressor teams were pitching and running the bases in what then looked like a shutout. But the World Series in that big league had yet to be played. Three years before, General Douglas MacArthur had retired from active duty to become military advisor to the Philippines. Dwight D. Eisenhower, then a field grade officer, was a member of MacArthur's staff. By coincidence, General George C. Marshall was appointed Chief of Staff the same day the Nazis invaded Poland. Omar N. Bradley was a member of the War Department's General Staff. Leslie J. McNair was Executive Officer in the Office of the Chief of Field Artillery. General Brigham Somervell was head of the Depression-born Works Progress Administration in New York City. It would be another year before General Henry Hap Arnold would become Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army Air Corps. Robert L. Eichelberger was still a colonel, commanding the 30th Infantry at the Presidio of San Francisco. George S. Patton, Jr., a colonel then, was post commander of Fort Myer in Virginia. Mark Clark was a member of the staff of the 3rd Division at Fort Lewis, Washington. General Walter Kruger commanded the 2nd Division at Fort Sam Houston, Texas. Courtney Hodges was then a colonel, assistant commandant of the infantry school at Fort Benning. Alexander M. Patch was serving as a lieutenant colonel on the infantry board at Fort Benning. Their commander-in-chief, the President of the United States, took the first step that was to make America the arsenal of democracy. In November 1939, Roosevelt signed a bill removing the Arms Embargo Act. Now we could supply the implements of war to England and France on a cash and carry basis. Full-scale Lend-Lease was still in the future, but our neutrality was starting to crack. The wheels of our industrial complex were beginning to turn. The slumbering, complacent giant among nations was awakening. Slowly, we began to increase our military manpower. The Army was authorized to recruit some 83,000 men. The Marine Corps, 10,000. The Navy, 42,000. But our combined military establishment was still less than 500,000 men. Hardly a token force in light of world events. Only a small handful of our forces was adequately equipped and partially trained for combat. In the spring of 1940, the Nazi war machine rolled into Denmark and into Norway. The gallant but small Norwegian army was forced to withdraw to last-ditch positions in the north. Poland was brutally crushed. In one deadly swoop, the Nazis overran Belgium, Luxembourg, and smashed across the French frontier. It was blitzkrieg, lightning war. The aggressors struck with massive air power. With armor, with mobile artillery. Strike fast, strike hard with overwhelming, ruthless force. Destroy entire cities, reduce them to ashes and rubble, along with the charred bones of their inferior civilian population. Show no mercy, destroy the will to fight, show them the hopelessness of resistance. Those were Hitler's orders. The British rushed in what combat-ready troops they had to try and help the French stem the German tidal wave that was sweeping the continent. Winston Churchill, an indomitable man of the century, born of an English father and an American mother, took over the reins of government. In America, another great leader put before Congress and the nation the urgent need for defense.
These are ominous days, days whose swift and shocking developments force every neutral nation to look to its defenses in the light of new factors. The brutal force of modern offensive war has been loosed in all its horror. Surely the developments of the past few weeks have made it clear to all of our citizens that the possibility of attack on vital American zones ought to make it essential that we have the physical, the ready ability to meet those attacks and to prevent them from reaching their objectives. Our task is plain. The road we must take is clearly indicated. Our defenses must be invulnerable, our security absolute.
The French army was fast disintegrating. British forces were saved from annihilation or capture by the miraculous evacuation at Dunkirk. Italy declared war against France and Britain. Paris, undefended, fell like a ripe plum into the Nazi basket of conquests. What remained of the French army retreated to Mediterranean ports for evacuation to North Africa, to live to fight another day and help win the victory. Hitler signed an armistice with France and became master of all Western Europe. He could now concentrate on the destruction of his greatest adversary, England. Only Britain, fighting for her life, and the Atlantic Ocean stood between the United States and what was then the most powerful conquering armed force the world had ever known. On the 1st of September 1940, in response to the growing peril, President Roosevelt called up 60,000 National Guardsmen from 26 states for 1 year's service. In the same month, for the third time in its history, Congress enacted a selective service bill. $16 million Americans registered for the draft. There were some who asked, why me? But the majority knew why. And despite any inner emotional conflicts, they responded in the same spirit as had their forefathers. They knew that the gutty men who made and preserved this nation never asked, why me? These were men who could look anyone in the eye and say, I'm proud to be an American and to serve my country in its time of need. From the cities, the towns, the villages, the farms, the plains and the mountains they came. Citizens from every walk of life, who would soon prove themselves to be soldiers in the finest traditions of the American fighting man. Within a year, our Army grew to 1,500,000 men. It would continue to grow to a peak strength of 8 million. They had to be trained to combat hardness if they were to meet and destroy an enemy already toughened and blooded by combat. A new and mighty army was being forged along new lines to meet the challenge of improved enemy weapons, new tactics, new stratagems. At last, our top military leaders were being given the wherewithal to implement plans they had made for the defense of America under direction of George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff. General Leslie McNair was charged with directing the gigantic training program. General Somervell was appointed Assistant Chief of Staff in charge of supply. His was to be a superhuman task. Dwight D. Eisenhower was to have a meeting with destiny. General Hap Arnold, Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army Air Corps, stepped up the training of much-needed pilots. America was rising up out of the rut of her apathy. She was beginning to understand the hard fact that she was an integral part of the world, a world that suddenly had become one of violence and brutality, one in which America would have to fight to the death if she were to survive. While we were marshaling our resources, England was being given the bloodbath Hitler had promised. Britain's Royal Air Force fought night and day, taking a heavy toll of Nazi bombers, inspiring Winston Churchill's famous statement that never had so many owed so much to so few. Americans knew what would happen to the United States if Britain fell. Our response to the desperate plea for help came late, but not too late, in 1940.
It is the purpose of the nation to build now, with all possible speed, every machine and arsenal and factory that we need to manufacture our defense material. We have the men, the skill, the wealth, and above all, the will. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
In North Africa, British forces were fighting an Italian drive upon Egypt. Nazi and fascist troops smashed into the Balkans, into Greece. The Greeks fought with their traditional courage, but were overwhelmed by the Nazi tidal wave. 1940 was a black year for what was left of the free world. 1941 was to be an even blacker year, during which the aggressors attacked the only two remaining major powers not yet at war, Russia and the United States. For the aggressors, it was to be the world or nothing. In June 1941, Hitler suddenly unleashed his forces against Soviet Russia. Sorely wounded, the Russian Bear retreated, falling back before the onrushing Nazi legions. There was only one major power in the free world to go, the militarily weak United States. Now she stood alone. But how long could she stand? The Asian Axis partner thought she had an answer to that, one that would complete the aggressor's pattern for conquest of the entire world. It was a quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii. A newly risen sun shone on beautiful Oahu. It was symbolic. It was the last time we were to be caught napping by a rising sun. The surprise attack was a staggering blow to our Navy at Pearl Harbor.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Soon, the fall of Bataan and the never-to-be-forgotten death march of thousands of American and Filipino troops. Many would never reach the prison 65 miles away. Hundreds met death along the way.
The immediate Japanese military objective was to knock out United States naval and air power in the Pacific at a single stroke. They reasoned that we were committed to eventual entrance in the war in Europe, convinced that we were incapable of fighting a two-front war. The Japanese were right in their calculations to the extent that Roosevelt and Churchill were to agree that the defeat of Hitler, the most powerful of our enemies, must have priority over an offensive against Japan. They followed sound principles of warfare to concentrate the greatest mass of power against the major objective. But it would be nearly a year before we could muster, train, and move an army overseas to attack the strongest of the aggressors. The first American troops to go into action and engage the enemy were those already in the Philippines under General Douglas MacArthur, whose forces would fight not only that first battle, but after more than 3 long years of combat, the final land battle against the last of the aggressors.
Three days after Pearl Harbor, Japanese troops landed on Luzon's north coast. The following day, still another Japanese landing was made on Luzon's east coast. On the 21st of December, the main Japanese invasion force hit the eastern shore of the Lingayen Gulf. Troops came pouring ashore from 80 transports. The Japanese onslaught gave General MacArthur only one choice: fight a delaying action, try to regroup his forces. It was a monumental task. The Japanese had struck swiftly, suddenly, devastatingly. They pressed forward unchecked. To save Manila from war's destruction, General MacArthur declared it an open city. Ignoring such humanitarian consideration, the Japanese bombed Manila. On the last day of 1941, MacArthur withdrew to the mountainous terrain of the Bataan Peninsula, for Bataan and Corregidor commanded Manila Bay. The objective was to delay the enemy's entrance to the bay. MacArthur and his battling bastards of Bataan, as the troops in grim humor called themselves, knew they were fighting a losing battle. But they fought on, gaining precious time for us to recover from the disaster at Pearl Harbor and build up our forces. There were other prime targets marked by the Japanese. In December 1941, they took Hong Kong and invaded Malaya. They bombed British Singapore and its great naval base. The British fought back, but it was the same losing fight that our troops were waging in Bataan. On New Year's Day, 1942, the siege of Bataan began. Superior Japanese forces pounded our beleaguered troops for 3 long and agonizing months. On February 22nd, 1942, President Roosevelt ordered General MacArthur to leave the Philippines and proceed to Australia as Supreme Allied Commander in the Southwest Pacific. MacArthur turned over his command to General Jonathan Wainwright. MacArthur made the first leg of his journey to Australia by PT boat through enemy-infested waters. And then by plane from Mindanao. Bataan fell on the 9th of April, 1942. Thousands of captured American and Filipino prisoners of war began their infamous death march. Hundreds were to die, felled by exhaustion and by the bayonets of their captors. To those self-designated battling bastards of Bataan, who starved and fought on, the nation owes a debt it can never repay. Theirs was a heroism seldom matched. Corregidor remained our last foothold. What once had seemed an impregnable rock fortress now awaited its inevitable doom. The fortunes of the United States and its allies were at their lowest ebb. But the Japanese were soon to learn that their homeland was vulnerable to surprise attack. April 18, 1942, 16 B-25 bombers led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle prepared to take off from the deck of the aircraft carrier Hornet. Their target, Tokyo, and 4 other major Japanese cities with carefully selected military targets. It was only 9 days after the fall of Bataan. Never before had such a carrier-based operation been attempted. The psychological effects of the raid on Tokyo were even greater than the material damage inflicted. It raised the morale of all Americans. It shocked the enemy into realization that we had the will and the wherewithal to carry the war to the heart of his own homeland. 3 weeks later, United States Navy planes of a carrier task force struck the Japanese fleet a damaging blow in the Coral Sea. The first naval battle in history to be fought entirely with carrier-based aircraft. While the Navy was starting to make a comeback, General Wainwright surrendered Corregidor. A proud old soldier who had fought in World War I and who now at the age of 59 was surrendering his sword without cause for shame. For he and his men had fought in the finest tradition of the American fighting man. Our stubborn defense of Corregidor had put the Japanese conquest 4 months behind schedule and sent General Hama back to Japan, relieved of his command. In January of 1942, President Roosevelt had addressed Congress and the nation to set new and immediate production goals.
First, to increase our production rate of airplanes so rapidly that in this year, 1942, we shall produce 60,000 planes. 10,000. 10,000, by the way, more than the goal that we set a year and a half ago. This includes 45,000 combat planes, bombers, dive bombers, pursuit planes. The rate of increase will be maintained, continued, so that next year, 1943, we shall produce 125,000 airplanes, including 100,000 combat planes. Second, to increase our production rate of tanks so rapidly that in this year, 1942, we shall produce 45,000 tanks, and to continue that increase so that next year, 1943, we shall produce 75,000 tanks. Third, to increase our production rate of anti-aircraft guns so rapidly that in this year, 1942, we shall produce 20,000 of them, and to continue that increase so that next year, 1943, we shall produce 35,000 anti-aircraft guns. And fourth, to increase our production rate of merchant ships so rapidly that in this year, 1942, we shall build 8 million deadweight tons as compared with a 1941 completed production of 1,100,000.
Immense forces were mobilizing. Millions of Americans were in training. The infantry, airborne infantry, field artillery, anti-aircraft artillery, armored cavalry, Army Air Corps pilots by the thousands. Woman power as well as manpower. The vitality of all America was surging up to full tide. American labor and management performed miracles. Planes, tanks, guns, ammunition. Tens of thousands of items rolled off the lines to supply not only ourselves, but our fighting allies. On the home front, 1942 was a momentous year. Great plans and stratagems were being laid and coordinated. Supplies by the millions of tons poured overseas. Nazi submarines took a heavy toll. But enough ships got through to help sustain our beleaguered allies. In the air, the tables were starting to turn. 1,000 Royal Air Force planes in a single massive saturation raid smashed Cologne, Germany. In the Pacific, our naval aircraft inflicted the first decisive defeat on a large Japanese fleet, winning the Battle of Midway. Triumph. There would be others, but they would be slow in coming. Our top military leaders were now taking the high places reserved for them by destiny. General Douglas MacArthur, commander in the Southwest Pacific, and Admiral Chester Nimitz. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was coordinating momentous plans with the Allied Combined Staff in the European Theater of Operations. General Leslie McNair, commanding general of all American ground forces. General Omar Bradley, commandant of the infantry school, soon to be given a top General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding Army Air Forces. General Brehon Somervell moved up to Chief of the Services of Supply with the stupendous task of logistical support for what would finally be an army of many millions deployed throughout the world. The first of our troops began arriving at overseas staging areas. In North Ireland, England, Australia. On bloody Guadalcanal, Army troops relieved battle-scarred and weary Marines to continue the fight for the Solomon Islands. The United States was demonstrating not only a will to fight, but the capability of fighting a two-front war against great odds on far-flung battlefronts half a world apart. On the 8th of November, 1942, American amphibious forces struck the shores of North Africa. We were, to use an appropriate American phrase, in business. The business of an all-out fight against powerful aggressors who had reached out to conquer the world. We had come thousands of miles, but not for conquest. In 1942, the commander of our ground forces, General Leslie McNair, said it best.
The United States is stretching out its arms to encircle the globe, not in conquest, but in protection. Even with our powerful allies, the task is vast and calls for our utmost all-out effort.
Our armed forces were encircling the earth in a mighty crusade for freedom. Nothing like it has happened in all the history of man. It was the dynamic outpouring of a great nation's energy, blood, and resources to protect not only itself, but to liberate freedom-loving people everywhere. We had come a long way, but the end of the road was far from within sight. We had only just begun to fight.